Hey everyone, some exciting news from over the weekend. Gladiator 2 finally has a release date. It's November 22nd of 2024. So that is amazing news. I'm so excited. Huge fan of the original, and it's been 20 plus long years since then. In this video, what we'll be doing is covering two sides of the story. The first side is going to be, well, what has gone on since Gladiator 1 to Gladiator 2? Over 20 years of history within that when it comes to production. So we'll be covering that. What's the cast, the crew, the script. There's been kind of rumors and hints over the years of different treatments. For instance, there's one where at the end of Gladiator 1, Maximus dies. There was a script treatment that had him waking up in the afterlife and having to deal with the gods and then finally being resurrected. There was some that treated him as like a Jesus reincarnated where he's with the Christians. There was other ideas where he might be fighting perpetually as an immortal resurrecting warrior who was in the Vietnam War. All kinds of crazy stuff. So that's portion one. We'll talk about how we got from Gladiator 1 to Gladiator 2. And then the second part of this video is going to be kind of theory crafting about what do we know and what are the hints that could give some insight into what Gladiator 2 could be all about. So part of that is going to be, let's look at the history of that particular time period, the death of Commodus. So we'll look at the year of the five emperors. We'll look at the impending crisis of the 3rd century and some other characters that could factor into this film. And then also what we'll be looking at is just generally history of gladiators, some stuff that could be relevant that they could pull into this film that they didn't pull into the first. So like Naumachia, the naval gladiator battles, and things of that nature. And ultimately, we'll conclude with a theoretical, at least my best guess, of what I think Gladiator 2 will entail. So without further ado, let's dive into it. I have a whole presentation. All right, so here we're looking at my dashboard for Gladiator 2. You can see here the original film being released in the year 2000, May of 2000 to be exact, and then now Gladiator 2 being scheduled for 2024. A lot of tidbits of information in their intervening years. So let's go back and look at the year 2000. Movie comes out. In 2001, it's reported that they had box office projections of $460+ million. That's out of a budget of $103 million. Adjusted for inflation, I think that goes up to about $700 million box office sales, plus all kind of the knock-on and kind of derivative sales over the years. It was a huge hit, kind of critically speaking as well. I got 5 Academy Awards, 7 nominations. And ever since they started and they got a big hit, they knew that they wanted to make a second one. So I've collected some notes for what were some of the early discussions here in 2001. So the first one was, well, Doug Wick took a crack at it. So he was the producer, I believe, for the first film, and he gave a script treatment. And I'll read you some quotes here. So he gave an interview with comicbook.com and some interesting ideas on where his head was. So first he said, I don't want a cheap exploit sequel. The follow-up must be worthy on its own. And he says there's lots of threads to follow, but ultimately, this was all complicated by the fact that their protagonist, Maximus, was dead. And so they were thinking, well, what can we do? Russel Crowe is hot right now. He's a big-name actor. We definitely want him back because that could sell, but we have this complication. So they had some ideas early on. One, the death at the end of the first film could be faked, but that was apparently shot down by producers. And then the other one was an idea that they could maybe go something down the route of Godfather 2. Where Godfather 2, basically it weaves in both prequel and sequel elements, so they could do something where you still have Russel Crowe as Maximus, but it's kind of like before Gladiator 1, maybe how he became a general, some stuff that would be important to the overall story, and then there'd be some after the fact, after he died, maybe dealing with an unknown son, or maybe Lucius or others. So those were ways to bring Maximus back. There's another idea, which is like, well, no, what if Maximus is literally just resurrected? So here's an interesting one where Russel Crowe in a later interview had the following to say. So I'll quote you on this. He says, I haven't talked to Doug in a long, long time. Last I talked to Doug, he said he had this great idea where Maximus gets carried from the stadium and they pull back this big rock and he gets put into this cave. And then the rock closes over and he's anointed with oils. And then the rock opens up and he comes out. And I said, Doug, I don't think we have the rights to that story. Obviously, this is like a parallel to Jesus. But that was a long, long time ago. And I don't think he appreciated my sense of humor at the time. So clearly, they want to do another one, but they're struggling with how do we get Russel Crowe back into the film? And this is where the movie seems to have started to stall out. Around the early 2000s, we have some rumors. Ridley Scott says the following, quote, you know I can bring him back. I know how to bring him back. I talked to him being Crowe into how I can bring him back. I use the body of a dying warrior as a portal to bring somebody back. So there, clearly he's indicating, okay, maybe Russel Crowe won't be involved. We've got various things, and we've talked about what those might be. Now here's another one reporting from MovieWeb. MovieWeb says, way back in 2001, the apparent storyline for a proposed follow-up would have followed Lucius. So Lucius, recall, is the young son of Lucilla, who's the one that Maximus saved. His closing statement before he dies is, Lucius is safe. He says that the first one. So they're starting to pick up on that being a possible thread. So back to this quote. Way back in 2001, the apparent storyline was for a proposed follow-up that would have followed Lucius 15 years after the first movie and picked up with an older-aged Lucius searching for the truth about his biological father. Lucius discovering that he's in fact the secret son of Maximus. So a take, but you can start to see that they're latching on maybe a second protagonist for this other film. And then they had some more crazy script treatments from Nick Cave here. And these ones are quite insane. This is the one about kind of the Vietnam War that I was alluding to. So let's read this to you in depth. So I have this report from Collider. And the summary of this portion here is Maximus awakens in the afterlife. He completes a task for the Roman deities. And he's resurrected as a Christian. And I'll read you the extensive quote here because it's really interesting. So from the article. Picking up shortly after Gladiator, Maximus awakes in Elysium, the Roman afterlife, whose idyllic landscapes formed his final waking thoughts before his tragic death. You know, the famous iconic scene where he's brushing his hands through the wheat. It goes on, only this is not the paradise he imagined, but rather a hellish environment, populated by thieves and heavy rain, and the souls too corrupted to ascend to the heavens. Guided by Mordecai, a guide of mysterious origin, he's taken before Jupiter and 6 other Roman deities where he's instructed to find and kill Hephaestus, one of their own who has betrayed them for another god. Complete their task, and he'll finally be reunited with his wife and son, achieving the dream he has held ever since the previous film. Soon after, he finds himself in Lyon, many years after his death, rising out of the body of a dying Christian amid a massacre being orchestrated by Roman legionaries. From here on out, the film follows Maximus as he returns to Rome, reunites with his old friend Juba, and contends with the new emperor Lucius, Commodus's nephew who has grown up just as heartless as his uncle. So that in and of itself is an interesting way to get Maximus back, clearly leaning on the fantastical in the first portion of it before it then kind of gets back into real world and he tries to get back into Rome. Various other articles kind of tell us what happens next. So this one from Screen Rant, basically the summary is Maximus then raises an army of Christians, discovers his son is not actually dead, returns to the Colosseum with a naval battle, and finally fights the new Emperor Lucius in the arena with his own son and Juba. So this is the exact quote. Maximus hooks up with a group of embattled Christians after initially trying to convince them not to fight, winds up helping them form an army. Along the way, Maximus discovers that his son Marius, who was supposed to have died in the first film, is actually alive and now a Christian. Maximus also reconnects with Juba, and the story builds to a pair of insane action sequences, one involving a flooded gladiatorial arena where men on ships fight alligators, the other a final battle sequence where Lucius kills Juba, then gets hacked to shreds by Maximus, and finally killed by an arrow from Marius. So that continues, and this is where it starts to get off the rails. So this is maybe a later script treatment where it got even more wild. So this one, again, from actually MovieWeb as a source, says... However, not long after the first movie's release, Nick Cave was commissioned to write a new draft of a sequel script, with the project leaning more heavily into the fantasy genre. So this is perhaps a twist or a riff, or maybe something completely different from the original, where he still plays on the supernatural, but now it seems like it's in a completely different direction. So the most interesting point here is describing the plot as a deities versus deity versus humanity story. The premise would have seen Maximus in purgatory before being resurrected as an immortal warrior fighting amongst the Crusades, World War II, and the Vietnam War, with the ending revealing that in modern day time period, the character now works at the Pentagon. So this is just like, you can see how things were starting to go absolutely wild with the script treatments. It's no surprise if this was being considered that a Gladiator film did not occur earlier. This one specifically, in an interview, Nick Cave ended up saying, I enjoyed writing this specific treatment very much because I knew on every level that it was never going to get made. So yeah, I can assume people behind the scenes might have been losing hope about ever seeing a Gladiator sequel anytime soon. Ridley Scott moves on to other projects, so does Russel Crowe. So this gets us to the late, 2010s. Interest kind of peters out from the various members, but then it starts to get resurrected, perhaps because of another script treatment. And I'll show you this here. So in 2018, news finally crops up that Gladiator 2 was actually greenlit by Paramount. Okay, so they have some sort of script in development, or they've found that now is the time to strike. This specific detail here says that Peter Craig was the one to give the script treatment. So he had previously worked on The Town, Hunger Games, The Batman, and the recent film Top Gun Maverick. So clearly a great writer. But I wasn't able to discern many details from his particular script. Whatever it was seems to have been the one that got Paramount interested and enough to have them green light it. So presumably it doesn't have more of those crazy off the wall details. Some little snippets that I was able to find seems to be that he wanted to move the focus from Maximus, so away from Russel Crowe, onto the young Lucius. So that seed was planted previously, and now it seems like that was kind of the direction they were going, and that's likely what got Paramount to finally approve, was this fundamental shift. So this focus on Lucius at this point out is going to be kind of the focus of the movie, it seems, and this is kind of the premise upon which it was confirmed. So now in 2019, official confirmation that the sequel is being developed and is actually going to be set 25 years after the first one. So that again aligns with the idea that we have young Lucius, who by this point, 25 years later, will be old enough to presumably be in some sort of gladiator battle of his own. And then what we have here is from 2020 on, there's some more details. So rumors build in 2020. Ridley Scott gives an interview. And he says, I'm already having the next Gladiator written now. So when I've done Napoleon, Gladiator will be next and ready to go. And just so you know, Napoleon is going to be a movie that's set to release later this year on Apple TV. And it actually features Joaquin Phoenix. So it has some of the same members from the original Gladiator. But it's not going to feature Joaquin Phoenix because obviously his character died in this movie. Although perhaps he'll have some sort of guest or throwback appearance. And then what's also interesting here is that Russel Crowe around this time gives an interview regarding his Unhinged movie, but they talk about Gladiator 2. And he says, quote, if they're having conversations about a sequel, those conversations have not included me. I'm not sure what they have in mind at all. Can I just say with a pinch of salt that they've genuinely been having the same conversations since the year 2000. So that is something that obviously harkens back to what we've talked about. There's been a lot of script treatments. And the idea here that Russell is saying, hey, they haven't contacted me is not really surprising, with the idea that the focus here, as we mentioned, is going to be on young Lucius, who now 25 years later is going to be grown up. So that's interesting. Now in 2021, Ridley Scott does an interview with Collider and he says, oh, it's been written. I have a good footprint, a good logical place to go. There's enough components from the first one to pick up the ball and continue it. So basically saying, not only has the script been approved, or the project been greenlit, but now they have a script that's written. But this is what's interesting. The script being written, saying it's done, later on we'll find out that Peter Craig is actually not the script writer. He did not do the screenplay. In recent news, what we will have found out is that actually the screenplay is going to be by David Scarpa. So there's been even more shakeups when it comes to the Gladiator script. So who knows how much of these earlier scripts have made it into the final. That being said, we finally get into 2022 and 2023. So this is where there has been some reporting by Le 360, where basically they say, hey, we saw that there's a production team associated with Gladiator 2 in Morocco in negotiations regarding the set. So this is kind of, okay, they're filming soon. Script is done the previous year. They announce it. Makes sense to do filming or at least some negotiations or some preliminary location shoots. And here's a specific quote from this article. It's been translated from the French. And it says, quote, Arthur Max, the designer responsible for overseeing the set of most of Ridley Scott's film sets, requested that the Jerusalem set, now owned by Atlas Studios, be reused in Gladiator 2. And then a specific quote, the team is in the middle of negotiations because the price that was proposed was considered a little excessive, taking into account the fact that it was the decorator Ridley Scott himself who made this decor, so starting from there they expected to be entitled to a certain kindness, explains this interviewee who requested anonymity. So this is really interesting for a couple reasons. The first is, while they are still doing location shoots, which is good, but the fact that they're using the Jerusalem set may inform us that they have perhaps some ideas of doing something similar, either filming in something that was like actual Jerusalem, which might say that the series has its own Eastern focus, or just using it as a more generic set. But either way, we start to get an indication of the direction the film is already going to go. And then finally here, this is going to be the release date has been announced. So let's just talk about this information that just came out and what we were able to glean from the recent news. So first one being release date, November 22nd, 2024. So we already led this video with that. Production team, director Ridley Scott, that's obviously a given. And this is the screenplay, so by David Scarpa. So this is different from previous writers that we had previously noted. David Scarpa seems to have been the one who finally got held with the baton here, and he is responsible for The Man in the High Castle, and unsurprisingly was involved in Napoleon. So this is that other period piece that Ridley Scott was working on, Joaquin Phoenix was working on, so a lot of collaboration there. It makes sense that David Scarpa would kind of carry on because they already had a working relationship. Also returning from Gladiator 1, we have the production designer, Arthur Max, who we previously quoted as doing some location shooting or discussions. And then we also have the costume designer, so Jan T. Yates, who's going to be joining us. And then in terms of actors, so they have not revealed much besides the idea that young Lucius, now grown up, they're not using the original actor, they're using a new actor, and that is going to be actually Paul Mescal. So he's actually been, I haven't followed much of his work, but apparently he's been Oscar nominated Best Actor, Aftersun, Normal People, God's Creature, so fairly well known. I may not be able to speak to him, but clearly well known in Hollywood and is kind of a up-and-coming rising talent. So taking a step back, you can see quite troubled release from Gladiator, but one good thing about this is the idea that it's Ridley Scott. He's done so many films, he's done a lot of period pieces, and they're bringing back a lot of the old crew from the original Gladiator. So despite it having some trouble in terms of how do we formulate it and sell it to the audience, I think now that they've finally gotten an idea that passed kind of greenlighting at Paramount, I think in terms of execution, it should be pretty straightforward. So that concludes kind of part one, which is how do we get from the original Gladiator to today's Gladiator, Gladiator 2. Now, if you want to do the second part of the video, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. I have prepared here even more details about the history involving this time period, some other relevant information we can pull in on the bread and circuses, some threads that need to be wrapped up from Gladiator 2000, and then some other details. And then finally, what I've done is I've reconstructed a theoretical outline for the movie Gladiator 2. So if you want to see that, stick around and we'll dive in. So, as regards the history, I think let's zoom in here. And what I've put together is a little bit of history that leads up to the Gladiator 1 film itself. So, just so you know, we're kind of following Roman emperors. So first you have Emperor Hadrian. This is the period of the 5 so-called good emperors, emperors who were able to steward the empire responsibly, share power, not abuse it, not be tyrannical. So you have Hadrian. Then after him, you have Antoninus Pius. And this is where it starts to get interesting. So Antoninus Pius passes on towards the end of his reign actually to 2 people. First time the Roman Empire is going to be led by 2 figures. The first is going to be Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius kind of assumes power a little bit before Antoninus Pius passes. So Marcus Aurelius comes on, starts to get some power. But there's actually a power sharing structure with Lucius Verus. So there's actually 2 emperors that are present during this time period. They're co-emperors. Marcus Aurelius is actually going to be the senior of the 2. Now, when Gladiator 1 movie comes out, you only ever hear about 1 emperor, and that's because Lucius Verus actually dies, and he dies in the year 169 versus the movie is set a little bit later. So just so you know, that's where the first film is set. Marcus Aurelius being the sole emperor, ignore his co-emperor, and they deal with him. Marcus Aurelius in the film dies. In reality, he dies as well. He's not killed by Commodus, but I think he dies of old age or some sort of disease. I can't remember. But anyways, they already tweaked it. So then you get to the rise of Commodus. Commodus is now emperor, and that's going to be the film. And he is not standing alone. So you have Lucilla. So she's going to be this one here. She may be familiar to you. She's the one whose son Lucius is here. And this is something that's not well described in the original film. Lucilla is actually going to be, well, obviously the daughter of Marcus Aurelius. That has a lot of importance. But also what's important is that she actually marries the co-emperor of Marcus Aurelius. Yes, he's older than her, but it's a kind of a political arrangement. And together they have several children. Most of them die, one of them being Lucius Verus. And he actually dies young, but in Gladiator 1, they keep him alive. So that is the importance of Lucius Verus. It's not just that he is, a relative of Marcus Aurelius, but he's a direct son of this other emperor that is completely ignored by the first film. So Lucius is actually far more important than is led on in this original movie, especially when you consider that Commodus is now dead. So, okay, clearly having royal blood in the aftermath of this is going to be important. So you have Lucius here. He's died, technically, but in the film he hasn't. So we'll get back to that. So historically, kind of what happens? Well, there's a plot against Commodus, and he actually has his sister here executed. In the film, she's saved, but in reality, she's executed. But ultimately, Commodus does meet the same fate. He ends up being killed. There is a final coup that takes him out. It's kind of chaotic. He's killed in the city. And what happens after the fact is that actually you have the urban prefect in the city. When it happens, his name is Pertinax. And essentially, when Commodus dies, he's kind of ushered by the Praetorians and others into the Castra Praetorium, and he is now crowned as the emperor. So this is interesting, and this is what kicks off the Year of the Five Emperors, because it's just going to be a quick succession of rulers, because it's just chaos when Commodus dies. The first idea is Pertinax is here. He rules for only 87 days, and he's anointed after the death of Commodus. He tries to emulate Marcus Aurelius, so okay, let's try and be a good philosopher emperor, but that is then curbed by the Praetorians, who step in. They really want him to give them favors, to pay them, and they're not too happy with him. So they end up killing him, and they auction off the crown. The man who buys the next crown is going to be Didius Julianus, and he buys the throne from the Praetorians. He's deeply unpopular for this. A lot of people obviously yell at him for being not the right emperor, of being a guy who just cheated his way in, bought his way in. So he's deeply unpopular. Once the news hits the provinces, more generals rise up and try and attack him. And so you have 3 emperors who rise up. Didius Julianus only lasts 66 days before 3 emperors rise up. Claudius Albinus, so he leads the legions of Britannia. Septimus Severus, who leads the legions of Pannonia. And then Pescennius Niger, who leads the legions of Syria. So basically armies coming from all corners of the empire, trying to descend upon Rome to then seize the throne. Now the first one to make it there is going to be Septimus Severus. He is most proximally located to Rome in Pannonia. It's just next door. He marches on Rome, and essentially as he does so, opposition melts away. Didius Julianus is killed. His Praetorians try and go into battle, but are brushed aside. Septimius Severus comes in, and he's essentially anointed by the Senate, and he founds the next Severan dynasty. But the other 2 contenders that were making a race for the throne are not going to lay down their army so easily. So now Septimus Severus has to turn to either side and fight them. He defeats this first character here at the Battle of Issus, so that's going to be in the Roman East, and then he turns west and defeats Claudius Albinus at the Battle of Lugdunum in 197. And this, it's not a battle that's super well attested to, but if numbers are to be believed, it had anywhere from about 100,000 to 300,000 men, if not more. It's one of the largest civil wars in Roman history. And to someone on the production side of things at Gladiator 2, I'm sure they looked at the historical event with, much anticipation and rubbing of hands. So that's an interesting feat. So, I could go on and on here. Some more details about Septimus Severus. You have this shakiness, he knocks away all contenders, and then finally, after people ruling for only a couple months prior to him, finally he establishes a little bit of a stable base of kind of peace. So he rules from 193 to 211. Some interesting details about him. He was actually from Africa, which is super interesting. So his mother was of Italian descent. His father was of Phoenician ancestry. And so he's kind of has a mixed look to him. And if you have this ancient image, you can see this is how he's depicted at the time. So he has mixed heritage, which is going to be kind of a first for Roman emperors, an emperor who is not from Italy proper, who has a mixed background and is from the provinces. So that, first and foremost, is a big shakeup to the way things are done at Rome. I have a note here. He spoke Latin, Greek, and Punic. And so that makes him just a very interesting, compelling character to hopefully include in Gladiator 2. In terms of his reign, it was a return to stability, at least internally, but externally he fought a lot of wars, and under him Rome reached its greatest extent, greatest glory, and there is some debate that he may have persecuted the Christians during his time in power, although we're not sure. But eventually he dies of illness in 211, and what happens after that is, basically as he's dying, he brings on his 2 sons, Geta and Caracalla, and he says, okay, sons, I'm going to start to give you more power. He preps himself for a dynasty. They start to be kind of co-emperors at the same time as Severus is alive. But upon his death, he essentially says, go on and govern. But he has a famous quote saying something to the effect of, you just have to be a soldier. Be a good soldier, know how to command men, and you'll rule. So basically, it's a shift from being this philosopher, emperor, soldier who rules the empire by, doing things right to more like might makes right type of idea, and you have to be soldiers. So he has these 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. Both of them are brothers, but neither of them gets along very well. Caracalla ends up getting the better of his brother, has him assassinated, and from there, there's a quote about him being soldier first, emperor second. He fights a series of wars, one of them being the final Parthian War, so he goes east. I have some notes about this Parthian War, where essentially he goes in, the Parthians to the east are having their own civil war. Romans take advantage of this. They kind of sack northern Mesopotamia. They take Arabella. They do some various kind of battles while the Parthians have their hands tied essentially with these other civil wars, until eventually actually Caracalla dies, and he's killed by a soldier who was kind of mad at him. I think Caracalla was actually taking a piss when a soldier came up to him and killed him, so kind of an odd way to go out. And essentially after his death, the Parthians rally. They then fight the Romans to kind of like a standstill at the Battle of Nisibis in 217. Heavy casualties on both sides. Both sides say enough and declare peace. And they go their own ways. And so after that, what you have is Caracalla has died. Macrinus then comes out, then Elagabalus, and then Severus. And basically you have a quick succession of a lot of rulers that then gets you to this last one, Alexander Severus, being the last of the Severan dynasty. And then after that, everything just kind of blows up. It's crisis of the 3rd century. Pretenders are cropping up from all sides. The Roman Empire splits into various empires. There's the Palmyrene Empire, the Gallic Empire, Rome itself proper in the center, barbarian invasions. It's just complete chaos. That's the crisis of the 3rd century. And alongside that, in the east, you have the Parthians being swapped out by the Sassanids. So that is the premise through which this film might be told. So let me give you some additional context. So Lucius Verus, okay, that is confirmed as being one of the major characters of this film. They said that the movie takes place 25 years later. So if we take the death of Commodus in 192 and we add 25 years, that gets us roughly to the movie being set in 217. So this is our first hint about what the movie might be about. If we take this literally, and they haven't changed the timeline, then that means that if it's set in 217, that's right when Caracalla essentially is killed. That is a very interesting coincidence, where the movie might be set in this kind of rapid succession of rulers leading to the crisis of the 3rd century. So my question here is, well, how do they get there if they decide to go down that route? And I did some digging, and I think there is a historical thread that they could actually follow. So we'll rewind the clock back up. We'll go up here, and this is where you see Lucilla, and she has the son Lucius Verus through this co-emperor. But here's what's interesting. Actually, when this first co-emperor died, and Lucilla was still alive, she actually remarried to another man. His name is Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, and he was another man of high importance. He had actually been a Syrian Roman. He was an important general and senator. He was actually in good with Marcus Aurelius and kind of served under Commodus, so a well-known guy. And he was actually, interestingly enough, he had refused the throne several times over when it was offered to him. So kind of like, cool, a good guy, kind of like how Maximus is in the film. And maybe they modeled Maximus after this character in his refusal to ascend to the throne. Now, this character does die in 193, but Lucilla and he did get a son. And here's an interesting thing where I think they might follow this historical thread. So their second son here is actually also named Lucius. So Lucius Aurelius Commodus Pompeianus. So you can see in his name, Pompeianus coming from this father here, Aurelius coming from Marcus Aurelius, and then within his name, Commodus coming from Commodus over here. So this is already a bastardization of his name, but here's the interesting part. Lucius and Lucius, I think that they're going to take this character Lucius and kind of fudge the details and say that this is Lucius. They're going to say that this is him, and they're going to follow his story somewhat. So what happened to this character? Well, what happens to him is at the time that Commodus is in power, this guy kind of goes off with his new father. He is distanced from Commodus, and he lives in the country estate with his father. Eventually what happens with this character is in the 190s, actually, he becomes a military tribune. We don't have many details of his life, but this is one of them, where he's in Gaul, supposedly, and he joins Legio I Minervia as a military tribune. So we have the idea that this character is young, grows up in the estate away from the politics of Rome, then joins the military, rises up the ranks, eventually becomes consul in 209 BC, and then later is actually killed by Caracalla in 212 AD. So this is a very interesting thread, because you can see the parallel between these two lines of the movie Verus, set 25 years later, puts us here, versus this actual Lucius, who dies roughly at around the same time. So I think that they're going to merge the two figures, and if the dates are correct, then they are probably going to have a confrontation here with Caracalla. So that is what I've been able to derive, broadly speaking, from the historical context. Some other things that I didn't quite mention in the first pass that they might weave into the idea is you have the Antonine Plague. Maybe they play off of that because of COVID. You have these lingering Parthian wars. That might be interesting as a new backdrop, as opposed to the first film, which used kind of the Germanic and Marcomannic wars, so kind of more of an eastward focus. So yeah, that's kind of my highlight of the general history. So what are some other things that could be included kind of historically related to this film? And I brought in some more details here on bread and circuses. So the first is going to be the Naumachia. I mean, they have to do this. So this is the famous idea that there was not just gladiator battles on land, but that they actually fought them out on the water. So we have a whole video on this on naval gladiator battles if you want to learn more. The nitty-gritty, the short and sweet of it is that, yep, they happened, they occurred, both out in the fields where they would essentially dig a giant lake, fill it with boats and have them fight, or they might use an existing lake, like the Phocian Lake, I believe it's called, and stage a battle there, or the Colosseum was actually retrofitted to be able to be flooded and evacuated of water. The problem with this story is it's most popular in the 1st century and not so much after Trajan. That's where we lose records of this. It seems to have fallen out of practice, but that's not going to stop anyone from Hollywood. So guarantee that there's going to be some form of a flooded gladiator battle. Other historical things that they could put in when it comes to gladiators is, well, I have some details here from our other series on gladiators. One could be that we have a historical attestation to Romans doing crazy things in the arena, one of them being putting monkeys on goats and dressing them up as soldiers and having them do a mock battle. That could be something super interesting to put into the film. Another one, just an interesting factoid, is that Romans actually had t-shirt cannon equivalents where they would have these little balls that they would put up, and there'd be a little string or a little piece of parchment attached that had like some sort of like, prize. So it said, this is number whatever. It corresponded to a prize. They would launch these into the crowds, and the prizes you could get are reportedly crazy. It could be anywhere from a piece of bread to an entire elephant, gold, a mansion, all kinds of crazy stuff. So that might be something as like a little historical add-on that they give to the film. Some other things that we might see is just more gladiators in general, different types. So you might have like a secutor or other people with like, the crazy fish hooks or tridents, or lean more into the variety of gladiators, including female gladiators. Those are historically attested to. Perhaps there could be a character that gets rolled in on that front. Now, other things that I wanted to talk about. So we're starting to get into, okay, what could the next Gladiator movie be? And this is where I wanted to cover Gladiator from 2000. What are some themes, highlights, and plot threads that are worth kind of informing our idea of what the next Gladiator might be? So here are some themes. Obviously, loss and revenge. This is the main driver. It's short and sweet. It's timeless. Maximus experienced loss, and he wants to get revenge. That's the driving throughput of the series, of the movie, that carries you through, where if you ignore all the politics, everything else, it boils down to that. That'll carry you as a film. So that is a very strong one. Other themes tacked onto that is the idea of slavery and freedom. That's just inherent when it comes to gladiators. You have the idea of tyranny, where obviously you have Commodus, who increasingly wants to exert his control and just lashes out at everyone. And then finally you have spectacle being a big one. The idea of the bread and circuses, the games, getting the crowds to love you type of thing. Now, in terms of highlights that went well for the first movie that I think are going to be replicated in some sort of way, you have an opening battle or a major battle that is definitely going to make its way back into the film. You have political intrigue that it's going to make its way back into the film. It also has a lot of cannon fodder for the writers when it comes to the Year of the Five Emperors or the Crisis of the 3rd Century. So political intrigue, that's going to be in there. More gladiator matches, because you can't call it Gladiator 2 without having some matches. So definitely expect that to be in there. And then, of course, fantastic sets and locations. So you're starting to see how this film is going to be put together. Now, finally, when it comes to kind of like the narrative, I'm imagining myself in the writer's room and I'm thinking, okay, what are the plot threads that I can pick up on? And to me, kind of reanalyzing Gladiator, I went back and watched it. There's a couple key moments that clearly carry over in retrospect. So here, I'll give you an outline. So the first one here is going to be the dying wish of Maximus. Clearly, how does the first film end? How can we transition from that? And I'll read you kind of quote. So you'll recall when Maximus dies, he says he's standing there, he's dying out, but he kind of whispers to Quintus what his last wishes are. And I'll read you quote. He says, "Quintus, free my men. Senator Gracchus is to be reinstated." And he says, then finally, "There was a dream that was Rome. It shall be realized. These are the wishes of Marcus Aurelius." And then finally, his last words are, "Lucius is safe." So as a writer, if I were to look at this, I would highlight this and say, oh, Lucius is safe. If I'm going to make another movie, let's definitely make sure that Lucius is safe. So that is why we're seeing the focus on Lucius, clearly because of those last lines. The other one that is interesting to me is, "These are the wishes of Marcus Aurelius." If I'm looking at this from a writer's perspective, I want to keep the through line of Marcus Aurelius in the first one. And so what is that through line of Marcus Aurelius? Well, if you go to the beginning of the first film, it's the wish of Marcus Aurelius. There's this famous scene, obviously, in the beginning, after the battle, where he's talking to Maximus about what does he want to do. Long and short of it is, "Hey, Commodus, he's going to kind of mess things up. I want you to be, my new heir." That's kind of the main takeaway. But if you really look at the details, and I'll read you this, we start to get a little bit more specific with the direction thematically they'll probably be taking the second one. So I'll read you verbatim. He says, this is Aurelius starting off. "Tell me again, Maximus, why are we here?" "For the glory of the empire, sire." And he responds, "For 25 years I have spilled blood, and for what? I brought the sword, nothing more. I will not believe my men fought and died for nothing. They fought for you and for Rome. What is Rome, Maximus? Rome is the light." And this is the kind of the central premise that we're getting to here. His response, "Yet you have not been there, seen what it has become. How will I be remembered? The warrior, the philosopher, the tyrant? Or will I be the emperor who gave Rome back her true self? I fear it will not... Or will I be the emperor who gave Rome back her true self? There was once a dream that was Rome. You could only whisper it. I fear it will not survive the winter. I want you to become the protector of Rome after I die. I will empower you to one end alone, to give power back to the people and end the corruption that has crippled it." And then, as we all know, Maximus declines, and Marcus says, "That is why it must be you. You have not been corrupted by her politics." So this to me is the crux of it. So this is the most important part, obviously, that I think if they're going to have anything carry through, you have the death of Maximus at the top. What does he want? Well, he wants what Marcus Aurelius wanted. And what does Marcus Aurelius want? He wants Rome to still be that light. And what is that light? Well, I want to empower you to give power back to the people. So that is a very important theme. That's going to be a crowd raiser in any day and age. Give power back to the people and end corruption. And so if that's going to be your theme, you have an amazing backdrop for that when it comes to what happens historically. Because historically, if you want to end corruption, and that's your main theme, and what happens immediately after Commodus dies is that you have 5 emperors, one of which buys the throne literally, the other emperors which get, chopped up by the Praetorians choosing their own emperors. That is the corruption inherent in Rome. And so that through line to the new film is essentially going to be, look at all this chaos that's going to happen. I think they're going to show it on screen such that you can see this is everything that is wrong, and Lucius is going to be the one who carries on the desire to get rid of all this and be the rightful ruler. And the interesting part here that I think is the closing line where Maximus basically says, "I don't want to be emperor," and Marcus says that's precisely why you should be emperor. That to me is very interesting, because that speaks to who is going to be this next figure to do things. It could be Lucius, or it could be Septimus Severus as an outsider, someone who is not in the inside of Roman politics, someone who can cleanse the corruption. And so I think Septimus Severus is going to be really key to the story, because he represents someone who is fresh blood. He looks different. He's got different ancestry, different ideas, and he finally brings stability after this period of the 5 emperors. So I think this could be an important figure, although you do see that timeline-wise, the movie is set after he has died. So I'm really interested to see where they take this film. So that is kind of a lot of the backdrop here. And finally, we can go over this section I have prepared, which is, what do I think Gladiator 2 could look like? Final notes to mention here is going to be, well, okay, who's going to be making this come to life? And we have here director Ridley Scott, and then scriptwriter David Scarpa. So there's a lot more people in the film, but obviously these are going to be the main ones whose minds are going to be shaping things. I've pulled out a couple excerpts of their work. where I think you can take bits and pieces of these films and they fit the setting really nicely. So the first one, House of Gucci, being everything about just politicking, backstabbing. How do you create your empire with kind of within the family? And that's all about the family structure of these various dynasties in the Roman Empire. So this is politicking down to a T. That's the internal intrigue covered. The Last Duel is more of a story about personal revenge, a rivalry between two figures. So I could see them using The Last Duel as kind of like a narrative template for a potential rivalry. If we go back over here to Lucius and his competition perhaps with Caracalla. So that could be some way that they leverage the work done by The Last Duel. Robin Hood is another one where, he comes, Robin Hood, Russel Crowe's character, comes back from a war. Things kind of go to all hell, but he kind of keeps his little area under control and eventually is the one who rises up to save the people. Kingdom of Heaven is another one that's an interesting thing that could tie in, where you have an unlikely hero who rises up and fights for the people. Kind of grand scheme of things be damned, he's just there to save the people. So there's a lot of interesting stuff you can pull in there. And then David Scarpa, as a writer, has experience with The Man in the High Castle, playing a lot with kind of historical what-if scenarios. So there's a lot to work on there. So now, finally, this gets us to the point that I wanted to present, which is what do I think happens in Gladiator 2 with all of that context in mind? And we can start here with basically, what is the basic 3-act story? So Act 1 is the setup for the characters and their goals, the hook, what's going on, you're plotting your course. Act 2 raises the stakes and the hero confronts the villain, and then Act 3 resolve the story. So we'll show you kind of what that looked like in Gladiator 1. So Gladiator 1, you have a couple key things that are the setup. First, you introduce Maximus. He's Rome's greatest general. How do they show that? By a big freaking battle that he's victorious at. Then they show Commodus is a schemer and he must not rule. And they show that with some of these scenes with his discussions with his sister, and then the revelation by Marcus Aurelius that, he doesn't want him to be heir. And then finally, Act 1 closes when the emperor is murdered and Maximus is on the kill list. So this is where you have that twist from Act 1 to Act 2 that sets things up. Now in Act 2, this is supposed to be where you get escalation and then a final confrontation with the villain. The way this happens is Maximus goes from a slave to gladiator, then he goes to Rome. At that point, he wins the crowd. And then this is where you get kind of the clash with your main villain, where he literally, you recall, he has that spiky helmet on. The emperor asks, who is this great victor? And this is where he takes off the mask. You get that famous scene, and he says, I will have my vengeance. And so that's literally the confrontation between hero and villain. And then from there, there's a plot that he works on with others to overthrow Commodus. And Act 3 is kind of the denouement of that, where, the coup fails. The coup fails and everything falls through. And everything is screwed. Maximus is going to die, but he has this final chance to duel Commodus. And so you shrink everything down and you boil it down to a singular incident of dueling Commodus. And then the story resolves by he actually kills Commodus and he has his dying wishes and he can see his family again. So that's a very clean 3-act structure. So what I've done is some thinking about what could Gladiator 2's 3-act structure be. And the first thing I did was, what is the through line that they'll put in the opening crawl? And I think the idea that we've identified is, the main kind of theme is going to be Marcus Aurelius's wish, the wish that Rome goes back to the people. And so I think the opening crawl will kind of start with that scene. Maximus is dead. You get maybe whispers of Marcus Aurelius saying it should be, going back to the people, it should be light. And I think what the opening crawl will literally say is, Rome is torn apart by civil war. The dream of Marcus Aurelius is all but dead, but his grandson lives. And, something like, and with him the dream. So essentially you're establishing that through line to Marcus Aurelius. Tell him, hey, don't care about the details. There's a civil war, and its grandson is here, and he's going to be the one who kind of brings that dream to life. So that's how you establish your new protagonist. Now, as for what they do. So what I think they'll do is that they will, like I said, use that other historical Lucius and kind of use him to plot this course of what happens historically. And I think right after Commodus dies, I think Lucius is going to start by being safe. Lucius is going to be, he's the son, he's the grandson of Marcus Aurelius and the son of his former co-emperor. So clearly he has a lot of value, but he's young, he can't rule. So I think the movie starts with Lucius, the rightful but powerless heir, and someone like his mother or some other regent is the one looking out for him. And then you have kind of insert name here, we don't know who, probably some big figure is going to be the protector of Rome and the protector of Lucius. So essentially the good guys are in power in the beginning, and they just have to wait long enough for Lucius to get old to ascend to the throne and kind of be the man he's supposed to be. And I think this regent, they could choose Pertinax or someone else, maybe someone from the original film. But what's going to happen here is you're going to have some villain who schemes and then corruption spreads. So someone who's going to break this kind of status quo. And I think it's likely to be a senator. And I think the historical analog is going to be the same one we saw here. Didius Julianus, who was a senator, I believe, who actually buys his way onto the throne by going through the Praetorians who killed the previous guy. So I think they're going to take that over. And basically Act 1 is going to start to end where some senator or some guy who's corrupt, the embodiment of the corruption that is not yet solved, comes in and destroys the status quo. The regent, the protector of Lucius, is killed, most likely his mother, in order to establish the stakes of the first movie, which is loss, and at the end you get revenge. So they're going to have to kill off someone he cares about. It's probably going to be his mother in the beginning. So to me, that's kind of a solid Act 1. You set things up. There's scheming, there's who's going to be the next ruler, and that's kind of Roman history at this period, is who's going to be the next ruler. There's literally 5 emperors in that year. So that's kind of, okay, you nod to history, you set up the character, the stakes, and you have Lucius as the only one who can, because he's kind of a through for Marcus Aurelius, the only one who can bring peace and all that. In Act 2, I really don't know what the details are going to be. They could take it in all kinds of directions, but I think it's going to be in the same way that Maximus went from great general to slave in Gladiator. You're going to have Lucius, who goes from, prince to something. I don't know if they're going to follow exactly the same thing where he's also going to be a slave and then also going to be a gladiator. I think that's a little too close. So I think they'll find some other way for that to happen. Historically, if we look at this kind of other character of Lucius, he was actually a military tribune. So we might see during this period, or maybe there's a time skip that happens that's, they might say, hey, Act 1, Lucius is on the run. The empire is now going to be, 5 people make a claim for the throne. Maybe they do a time jump. And within that time, Lucius has risen up through the ranks. He's kind of hidden away from the law. He's changed his name and he's entered the army as a way to seek protection. So maybe that's how he goes from prince to unknown soldier. And then Act 2 is going to be all about building up his strength, making connections to ultimately confront the corruption that has taken over Rome and fulfill the wishes of Marcus Aurelius in the final act. I don't know exactly, what goes on here or how you shoehorn in gladiator combat. If you go the same route as Gladiator 1 and say, hey, Lucius is just going to be a gladiator and he's going to learn from the skills of Maximus to be a great gladiator as well. Okay, fine, but it may be too much retreading, but that's kind of the most natural way for them to shoehorn in gladiator battles. If not, he's some sort of kind of third-party observer to them. Maybe as he's building up his strength and his power, maybe he's recruiting from the gladiator pits or former people that he knew within the gladiators who recognize him. Maybe this is where he pulls in Juba or other former folks. Or maybe this is where they pull in the Christian angle, where he joins Christian, becomes Christian, knows Christians. Christians get persecuted. They end up in the arena. So there's some angle there, but I don't really think they're going to lean into the Christianity too much because it's kind of distracting from the main themes. You throw in Christianity and the persecution angle, and you have kind of too much flavor stewing, and I think it's a little too distracting. So Act 2, we still need more details to figure this out. But Act 3, I'm pretty sure, is going to be wish of Marcus Aurelius is fulfilled, and I think there's kind of 2 main ways to do this. The first is that Lucius himself comes up, becomes emperor as he was supposed to be, but in doing so kind of allows power to transition back to the people, back to a republic. So a movie could end kind of happy, he's alive, and he passes things on, and it's Rome reforged. The other thing that is more likely that I think is that Lucius, in the same way that Maximus sacrificed himself, ends up as a sacrifice, and in some way goes on to allow this wish to be fulfilled, but it comes at the cost of his life. That to me is a more likely, more dramatic end to the film. And you can have some parallels. Maybe he sees Maximus in his dreams at the end, or something could happen. But I think this is the more likely outcome. Now, how exactly does he do this? So what is the greater good? Is it for the people? Is it to get rid of a bad ruler? So Caracalla, maybe he does a duel with his main rival Caracalla. Or is it to elevate a good ruler, who we said before might be Septimus Severus, who's this outsider who comes in and forms a new dynasty that they might frame as being more good than it probably was historically. So those are my thoughts. And I think you can kind of graft on some ideas onto this final conclusion based on the conclusions of other films of Ridley Scott. So here's one of them. Kingdom of Heaven famously ends with the big siege of Jerusalem. I think they could go down that route, where in this way it could be the siege of Rome or Antioch or some other major city, where in Kingdom of Heaven you have Orlando Bloom, who's like, the last good knight, uncorrupted, and he's a good man, and he's just there to defend the city, not for some geopolitical reason, but to save the people. So that could be very nice for Lucius, where he's kind of this guy, he's not corrupted, he just wants to save the people, and then maybe that's just the movie ends with him saving the people of Rome from one of these other major players, and he doesn't get involved, but the movie knows he saved the people at a minimum. That could be one angle. Another angle, like I said, is to go the route of The Last Duel, where Lucius has some big rivalry. He's been wronged, obviously, with the death of his mother or other people in the beginning of the film, and there's this kind of rivalry, perhaps with Caracalla towards the end, that they could build upon, and it ends in a duel, as this film does. And then finally, you could have something that's kind of like a la Robin Hood, where Robin Hood literally rides to the rescue of this day of a greater power and helps turn the tide. So the way they could do this in this Gladiator 2 film would be that Lucius rides to the rescue of Septimus Severus, who is this good guy who might otherwise be destroyed were it not for Lucius, who rides in and saves the day. So yeah, that is a lot of what's been kind of bumping around in my brain the last couple days. Let me know what your thoughts are. I'm really interested to see how you would kind of script, with all the information given and what information you know otherwise, how you would actually script your own Gladiator, acts 1, 2, and 3, and what you, let me know what you think and what the odds are that you think I'm on the money here. Anyways, I've rambled on long enough. See you guys in the next one, and definitely check out our Gladiator series and our other content if you haven't already. Peace out.